It begins with silence, but not the kind of silence that soothes a man's heart. This silence was heavy, damp, suffocating, like a wet cloth pressed over the mouth. Imagine standing in the middle of a jungle at 3:42 a.m., when the mist clings to your skin like ghostly fingers, and even the trees seem to hold their breath. Beneath your boots, the ground is soft, unnatural, as though something alive is shifting just beneath the soil. This is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of something waiting, watching. Welcome to War Files Uncovered, where the stories that history tried to bury are pulled screaming from the shadows. If you think you know the Vietnam War, stay with us because the truth lies underground. By 1965, the Viet Cong had expanded a labyrinth that stretched under the villages and jungles of Vietnam, a hidden underworld built with sweat, blood, and unthinkable endurance. For nearly 8 years they had lived there, carving out chambers that served as kitchens, hospitals, armories, even nurseries where children were born under earth that trembled from bombs above. It was a city of shadows where daylight never reached, and where every sound carried the weight of death. American and Allied soldiers who dared to enter these passages described stepping into a living nightmare, complete darkness pressing against their eyes, the stench of damp soil mixed with rot and gunpowder, the feel of unseen insects crawling over bare skin. They crawled on their bellies through spaces barely wide enough to breathe, their rifles useless in the narrow black throat of the earth, every inch alive with the promise of sudden violence. In that underground maze, a man could vanish forever, his screams swallowed by walls of dirt. The tunnels were not just a weapon, they were a mouth, and once you entered, you belonged to them. The war itself was already a fever dream of chaos and betrayal, a story written in fire and bone long before the first American boots touched Vietnamese soil. The Vietnamese called it the American War, but to understand why millions of men, women, and children found themselves caught between empires, you have to trace the roots back further, to a century of invasion and oppression. The French came first, their flags planted in rice paddies already soaked with blood. Then the Japanese, who swallowed the land during World War II. Each wave left scars, but each also sharpened the will of the people beneath them. Guerrilla fighters began their desperate wars in the 1860s, waging small, vicious battles that never seemed to end. They were crushed again and again, their bodies burned, their leaders executed. Yet somehow they always rose again. As the world convulsed with wars in Europe, Africa, the Americas, Vietnam became a crucible, a place where hope and hatred were buried in the same shallow graves. The story turned darker in the 1930s, when a man named Nguyen Sinh Cung, later known to the world as Ho Chi Minh, took the broken pieces of his country's suffering and reforged them with an idea more dangerous than any weapon: communism. Inspired by Lenin, fueled by a lifetime of exile and hunger, Ho found fertile ground in the working class, who had nothing to lose but chains. Hatred of the French colonizers mixed with resentment of the Japanese occupiers, and from this poison grew something far stronger: an organized movement, disciplined, patient, relentless. By the end of World War II, when Japan's empire collapsed, the confusion left in its wake became the opening Ho had been waiting for. In 1945, his Communist Party seized the North. Out of the ashes, the Viet Minh were born. Out of the Viet Minh, the Viet Cong emerged, soldiers of the earth itself, fighting a war of shadows. They began to dig. At first, the tunnels were crude, nothing more than shallow holes to hide from French patrols, places where families could huddle while soldiers swept through villages with fire and bayonets. But with every raid, every massacre, every execution, the tunnels grew deeper. They became arteries, pumping fighters unseen across the land, their openings hidden beneath cooking pots, animal pens, and piles of manure. By the time French forces finally staggered out of the jungle, the tunnels had become something else entirely: a world within a world, a place where even time seemed to bend. And when the French left, the Americans arrived, bringing more fire, more steel, more blood. And still the digging continued. Above ground, the war roared. Bombers filled the sky, unleashing firestorms that turned forests into skeletons and villages into ash. Agent Orange fell like poisoned rain, seeping into the soil, burning skin, withering crops. Napalm turned night into day and day into nightmares. Civilians ran, screamed, died in numbers so vast the earth itself seemed to choke on them. And yet, beneath that apocalypse, the tunnels lived on. When bombs fell, the ground shook, but deep below, men and women lay silent, pressing their bodies flat against the dirt, their lungs aching for air. Mothers gave birth in suffocating caverns lit by candles. Doctors, with nothing but knives and pliers, cut off infected limbs while the screams of the wounded echoed down corridors built to twist and turn, so that no sound ever revealed its source. It was hell, yes, but it was also survival. Every bomb above only drove the Viet Cong deeper into the earth, and deeper into the minds of the soldiers who hunted them. The Americans called them Victor Charlies, but that name carried no weight in the jungle. What terrified the soldiers was the enemy they could not see. Patrols would push into villages, rifles ready, eyes scanning tree lines that seemed to whisper with danger. Then the gunfire would erupt, sudden and everywhere, and by the time they returned fire, the enemy was gone. Not vanished into the jungle as they first believed, but into the ground itself. It was like fighting ghosts, and ghosts do not die easily. Some tunnels ran under American bases themselves, allowing the Viet Cong to strike from beneath, like phantoms clawing their way out of the soil. Soldiers described the sickening shock of watching a comrade fall, bullets tearing through him, and realizing the shooter was not out there among the trees, but beneath their very feet. The earth itself had become the enemy. But if the tunnels gave the Viet Cong power, they also demanded sacrifice. Life underground was a torment. The air was thick, foul with smoke and sweat, the constant risk of collapse pressing down on every chest. Food was scarce, water contaminated. Diseases spread, and sometimes after days of bombardment, bodies were dragged inside, buried into the very walls to hide the true death toll. The smell of decay became so common it was like another companion in the dark. Yet still they endured. For the Viet Cong, the tunnels were not just shelter, they were destiny. Each twist, each trap, each suffocating passage was a promise. They would fight to the last man, the last woman, the last child if necessary. Above ground, the Americans rained fire. Below ground, the Viet Cong carved eternity. And then came the men who dared to follow them inside. The tunnel rats. Small, wiry volunteers or the unfortunate picked by commanders for their size, these soldiers were sent crawling into the earth to hunt the enemy where they lived. Armed only with pistols, knives, and courage twisted into madness, they slid into blackness knowing that 1 in 3 would never return. Inside, the war became something different, something primal. Darkness pressed against their skin like a living thing, the silence broken only by the sound of their own breathing, and then, sometimes by something else, breathing that was not theirs. Some spoke of crawling through a passage and suddenly smelling another man's sweat, another man's fear in the dark ahead. Some met the enemy with gunfire, deafening in the cramped space. Others met them with knives, hands, teeth. Death was personal here, face against face, shadows wrestling in the dirt. Some tunnel rats returned with ruptured eardrums, scarred bodies, haunted eyes. Some never returned at all, their bodies left behind in a grave no wider than a coffin. The Viet Cong respected them, even as they killed them, calling them demons for daring to invade the underworld. But respect was cold comfort when the earth swallowed you whole. The tunnels stretched for hundreds of miles, crisscrossing under jungles, rivers, even the capital city of Saigon itself. Some went as deep as 30 feet, with 4 levels stacked like the layers of hell. They were dug with hands, shovels, tin bowls, the dirt carried away in bags at night and scattered in bomb craters so no one would notice. Trapdoors were camouflaged so perfectly that men stepped on them without knowing. Some were even underwater, hidden in riverbanks or disguised as anthills. Every entrance was a lie, every path a test. Inside, rooms opened up like tombs. Supply caches stacked with stolen American weapons, meeting halls where commanders planned ambushes, and crude hospitals where bones were sawed through without anesthesia. Fires were lit, their smoke funneled through vents disguised by mud and leaves, their smell masked with chili peppers to confuse the dogs sent hunting. It was genius born of desperation, horror born of necessity. By the late 1960s, as American forces swelled to nearly 500,000, the war had become something grotesque, a cycle of death that devoured soldiers and civilians alike. Patrols ventured into the jungle and never came back, lost to traps designed to maim as much as kill. Mines buried in flower beds. Bamboo spikes coated with feces, waiting in pits for a careless footstep. Tripwires strung to grenades hidden in souvenirs, flags, helmets, even toys. Every path was a question of survival, every step a gamble. More than 11% of Allied deaths came not from gunfire, but from traps, devices built with patience and a cruel kind of creativity. Those who survived often wished they had not, their bodies shattered, their wounds rotting in the tropical heat. The jungle itself turned against them. Mosquitoes carrying disease, snakes coiled in branches, leeches sucking blood until the skin sagged. Men stumbled through the heat, hallucinating, paranoid, never sure if the villager offering them water was a friend or a killer waiting for nightfall. It was in this nightmare landscape that one Australian sergeant, resting in exhaustion on a patch of jungle floor in 1966, felt a sharp pain in his thigh. He leapt up, cursing, and saw he had sat on a nail protruding from a wooden door. But it wasn't a door at all. It was a trapdoor. Beneath it, a tunnel. Inside, 30 Viet Cong fighters crouched in silence, just feet below the unsuspecting soldiers above. The realization was like a crack in reality. This was no ordinary war. This was a war where the enemy lived beneath your shadow, where the earth itself became a battlefield, where you could never be sure that the ground wouldn't open and swallow you whole. And that was only the beginning. There is a moment when you first descend into the belly of the earth that you realize you are leaving the world of men and entering the world of nightmares. The tunnel rats knew it well. Their bodies slid down narrow shafts, the air stale and damp, their fingers trembling as they reached for the cold dirt. Behind them, daylight shrank to a pinprick, then vanished. Ahead stretched only blackness, the kind of blackness that seemed to press into your lungs, suffocating you before the enemy even lifted a finger. Some soldiers claimed they could feel the tunnels breathing, as if the earth itself was alive, drawing them deeper into its gut. And once inside, the line between hunter and hunted blurred until even the bravest men prayed for escape. The tunnels were designed with a genius that bordered on madness. They twisted and turned, doubled back on themselves, dropped suddenly into pits, then rose into chambers that felt like the stomach of some ancient beast. Straight lines were rare. Instead, sharp corners and blind turns forced intruders to slow, to hesitate, to wonder if the next step would trigger a trap. Grenades tossed inside rarely killed anyone. The bends absorbed the shockwaves, the walls swallowed the fire. Smoke and gas drifted harmlessly into dead ends, leaving attackers coughing while the Viet Cong slipped silently away. For every passage cleared, 3 more waited. The deeper the soldiers crawled, the more they realized these tunnels were not just dug into the earth. They were carved into the soul of Vietnam itself. Inside, life was both impossible and eternal. Families lived in silence, their voices hushed, their footsteps softened to whispers. Mothers nursed babies who had never seen the sun. Fighters slept inches away from death, pistols resting on their chests, their ears tuned to the faintest scrape in the dirt. In the kitchens, smoke was carefully funneled through narrow vents, dispersed so that no single plume betrayed their existence. Doctors improvised with bicycle pumps, glass bottles, whatever could be found. Blood transfusions performed in chambers lit only by candles, amputations carried out with pliers and kitchen knives. Patients bit down on sticks or rags, their screams muffled into the walls. Many didn't survive, their bodies buried into the soil itself, their flesh merging with the tunnels they had helped build. It was a life that should have broken the human spirit. Yet it forged something unbreakable instead. The tunnels became wombs as much as tombs, birthing a will to fight that could not be bombed out of existence. American commanders soon realized they had underestimated their enemy. Rolling Thunder, the relentless bombing campaign that scorched the jungle and poisoned the rivers, was supposed to break the Viet Cong. Instead, it only drove them deeper underground. Even as the skies rained fire, the tunnels pulsed with new life. Supplies moved unseen. Fighters emerged from hidden trapdoors to ambush patrols, then vanished like ghosts before reinforcements arrived. Some tunnels ran so close to American bases that enemy fighters could crawl beneath the very ground where soldiers slept, waiting for the moment to strike. There are reports of gunfire erupting inside supposedly secure perimeters, soldiers falling to bullets fired from holes in the earth no bigger than a fist. Imagine lying in your bunk at midnight, the jungle humming outside, when suddenly shots rip through the night, and you realize the killers are not out there but beneath you. The ground itself has betrayed you. The terror was not just physical but psychological. The Viet Cong understood that fear could kill more effectively than bullets. They littered the jungle with traps designed to mutilate, to horrify, to poison the mind as much as the body. Tiger traps, heavy logs studded with spikes, swung down from trees when a tripwire was pulled. Pits filled with sharpened bamboo stakes lay hidden under leaves, coated with feces so that even a glancing wound festered into a death sentence. Mines were disguised as harmless trinkets, flags, even children's toys. Soldiers who survived the blast often carried scars that were worse than death, reminders of a war that seemed to hunt them with every step. Reports estimate more than 11% of Allied deaths were caused by traps, but the numbers tell only part of the story. For each man killed, dozens more were broken, their spirits corroded by paranoia. They no longer trusted the ground beneath them, the villagers around them, even their own senses. Every flower might conceal a mine. Every shadow might hide an enemy. Every smile from a child might be a mask for murder. The jungle itself had become hostile, its beauty twisted into cruelty. It was in this landscape that the tunnel rats earned their legend. Selected for their size, often no taller than 5.5 feet, these men volunteered, or were volunteered, for the most terrifying mission imaginable, crawling into the tunnels to destroy them from within. Armed with little more than a pistol, a flashlight, and a knife, they descended into hell. Rifles were useless, the passages were too narrow. Even pistols were a liability. Fired underground, the blast could rupture eardrums, blind with muzzle flash, disorient with concussive shock. Many resorted to smaller calibers, homemade silencers, or even bayonets, fighting in silence to avoid drawing more death. Each step was a gamble. At any moment, a concealed hatch could spring open, a spear could thrust from the dark, or the floor could collapse into a pit of spikes. Some tunnels were designed with vertical shafts, perfect for dropping grenades onto intruders. Others bent into U-shapes, flooded with water, forcing men to hold their breath as they crawled, unsure if the passage ahead was open or blocked. There were traps filled with scorpions, snakes tied to ceilings, boxes of hornets triggered by tripwires. Even when no enemy lurked, the tunnels themselves seemed intent on consuming those who dared to enter. Survivors spoke of sensations that words could barely capture. The suffocating heat. The stale air that grew thinner the deeper they crawled. The way sound carried, amplifying a single drip of water until it seemed like footsteps, turning your own heartbeat into thunder. Some recalled the horror of smelling another man in the dark before ever seeing him. Sweat, fear, breath. One Marine remembered his first kill underground, crawling forward, paralyzed by dread, when suddenly he knew someone was there. He could smell the breath of his enemy. The man lunged, and in the struggle, the Marine's pistol jammed. In desperation, he wrapped his hands around the unseen throat in the dark and squeezed until the body went still. He emerged hours later, filthy, shaking, his ears ringing with silence. For every story told, countless others were never heard, their tellers buried somewhere in the earth, swallowed by the tunnels they dared to enter. The casualty rate was staggering. 1 in 3 tunnel rats never returned, their bodies either destroyed by traps or entombed in collapses. Those who survived often bore wounds that never healed. Not just the scars of battle, but the nightmares that followed them home, shadows of the tunnels haunting their sleep. The Viet Cong themselves acknowledged their bravery, calling them devils. But bravery does not always save you. The tunnels were endless, and for every chamber cleared, another waited, another enemy crouched in silence, another trap sprung. The war beneath the ground mirrored the war above it, an endless cycle of blood and futility, where victory was measured not in land gained but in bodies counted. Meanwhile, above ground, frustration curdled into brutality. Allied soldiers, unable to strike back at an invisible enemy, turned their fury on the villages. Homes were burned. Airstrikes were called on communities suspected of sheltering Viet Cong. Civilians were beaten, interrogated, killed. Trust eroded until every villager was seen as a potential enemy. Yet the cruel irony remained. Many villagers were caught in the middle, despised by both sides, their loyalty demanded, their lives expendable. Some smiled by day, offered food or laundry services, only to attack at night. Others resisted the Viet Cong only to be punished by Allied suspicion. Innocence became impossible. The line between friend and foe blurred until every face in the jungle was an enemy, every shadow a trap, every step a roll of the dice. By early 1966, after nearly a year of operations, Allied forces stumbled upon the true scale of the tunnels. Near a rubber plantation outside Saigon, Australian and American troops discovered an entrance that led to an underground network far beyond anything they had imagined. Sergeant Stuart Green, weighing barely 130 pounds, was the first to slip inside. What he saw chilled him. Dozens of Viet Cong crouched silently just below the earth, close enough that the men above could have heard their breath if they'd only listened. Smoke and gas failed to flush them out. Explosives barely scratched the surface. The tunnels absorbed it all, twisting, hiding, enduring. For the first time, the Allies realized they were not fighting just an army. They were fighting the land itself. A land that could bleed. A land that could swallow them whole. And yet, the deeper the soldiers went, the more the tunnels seemed to fight back with something beyond human. Corpses were buried into the walls, their faces half exposed, their rotting flesh mingling with the soil. The smell clung to everything, seeping into uniforms, hair, lungs, until men gagged and wept in silence. Rats the size of small dogs scurried through the passages, feeding on scraps, sometimes on the dead. Some tunnel rats, desperate and starving, ate them too. There were stories, whispered, never confirmed, that Viet Cong fighters fed their own dead to keep others alive, that the tunnels themselves were built not just with dirt but with bones. True or not, the effect was the same. Soldiers believed the tunnels were haunted, cursed, alive with the restless dead. And perhaps they were. Every hour spent underground was a test of sanity. Men crawled for what felt like days, only to surface miles from where they began, disoriented, broken, gasping for air. Some emerged only to be shot by their own comrades, mistaken for the enemy. Others never emerged at all, their last moments spent in darkness, clawing at the dirt as the earth collapsed around them. Above, the war raged on, villages burned, skies roared with fire. Below, the tunnels endured, unbroken, unyielding, eternal. And with each passing day, the realization grew heavier, pressing into every soldier's mind. This was not a war that could be won. Not here. Not in the belly of the earth, where shadows ruled and death wore a human face. The story of the tunnels is not one of victory or defeat. It is a story of survival, of horror, of the lengths to which men will go when the world above collapses into chaos. It is a story that still lingers in the soil of Vietnam, where scars run deeper than any map can show. And it was far from over. There comes a point in every war where the numbers stop making sense. By 1968, nearly 500,000 American soldiers were choking in the jungles of Vietnam, joined by hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese, Australians, New Zealanders, Koreans, and Thais. And still, the tunnels stretched beneath them like veins of some monstrous body, alive, pulsing, untouchable. The men above fired bullets into the trees, dropped fire from the skies, clawed at an enemy they could never catch, while below, in the narrow throats of the earth, the Viet Cong bided their time. The ground itself had become a second battlefield, one that no bomb could conquer, no tank could breach, no machine could map. Every night, soldiers dreamed of dirt collapsing on their faces, of breath stolen by the blackness, of hands reaching from the soil to drag them down. For many, the war was no longer about communism or democracy, victory or defeat. It was about surviving the tunnels, surviving the jungle, surviving tomorrow. Operation Rolling Thunder had scorched the land for years, raining down more explosives than all the bombs dropped in World War II. Forests were shredded into skeletal remains, rivers clogged with ash, villages erased as if they had never existed. Yet the tunnels endured, snaking deeper, branching further, immune to the apocalypse above. Farmers tilled poisoned fields, their hands blistered by Agent Orange, while children were born with twisted limbs, their futures already stolen. In the black corridors below, life continued. Mothers still whispered lullabies. Fighters still carved traps with knives and bamboo. Doctors still sawed through bone with pliers, their patients screaming into rags. Every day the Americans poured more fire onto Vietnam, and every day the earth swallowed it whole. The tunnels were not destroyed. They adapted. They multiplied. They waited. For the soldiers who faced them, madness was not an enemy, it was a companion. Patrols returned bloodied and broken, their friends maimed by mines hidden in flowers, spiked pits concealed by leaves, tripwires strung across jungle paths. Men learned to mistrust everything. The smile of a villager, the silence of the trees, even the ground beneath their boots. Some soldiers cut ears from their victims, stringing them as trophies. Others shoved cards into the mouths of corpses, grim calling cards to scare an enemy who could never be seen. Yet the Viet Cong were not immune to horror either. They awarded medals for kills, titles like American Destroyer Hero, their twisted honors fueling men who had already lost everything. In the tunnels, the lines between human and monster blurred, and war became nothing but survival. The tunnel rats kept crawling, kept dying. 1 in 3 never returned, swallowed by traps too cruel to describe. Imagine crawling on your belly, sweat dripping into your eyes, when suddenly the earth beneath you gives way. You plunge into a pit of sharpened stakes, coated in human filth. Your scream echoes down the passage, but no one can reach you. Or imagine a tripwire snapping and a box of hornets exploding into your face, their stings blinding you as footsteps approach from the dark. Imagine the silence of crawling forward, hands feeling the dirt, when you brush against something slick and realize it's the corpse of a man buried into the wall. His eyes still open, his skin decaying, his jaw frozen in an eternal scream. Some men swore they heard voices in the tunnels, whispers in languages they did not understand, the sound of laughter echoing where no one lived. Haunted or not, the tunnels broke them. Those who survived crawled back into daylight with eyes that never stopped darting, ears that never stopped straining, souls that never stopped remembering. And then came the Tet Offensive of 1968. It was the moment the tunnels revealed their true power. Across South Vietnam, Viet Cong fighters emerged like phantoms, striking in cities, towns, villages, even inside Saigon itself. Hidden passageways carried soldiers into the heart of enemy strongholds, their movements unseen, their attacks devastating. For days the country burned. Though the offensive was eventually repelled, the message was clear. The enemy could strike anywhere, anytime, from beneath the very feet of the world's strongest army. American confidence cracked, and the horror of the tunnels became a symbol of an unwinnable war. Still, the fighting dragged on. Men died in the jungles. Children died in the villages. Families lived and died in the tunnels. By 1970, the war had become a grotesque stalemate, a machine devouring bodies with no end in sight. Tunnel rats kept crawling. Bombers kept flying. The tunnels kept breathing. And the world above began to ask, why? Why bleed for a land that refused to be conquered? Why fight an enemy that lived in shadows, an enemy who could vanish into the earth? In the United States, protests swelled. Streets filled with voices demanding the war end, coffins returning home draped in flags fueling rage and sorrow. The tunnels had done more than hide fighters. They had swallowed America's will to fight. By 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. American forces withdrew, their helicopters lifting into skies heavy with smoke, leaving behind allies and enemies alike. Yet the war did not end. For 2 more years, the tunnels pulsed with life, carrying fighters, weapons, and whispers of final victory. And in April 1975, the inevitable came. North Vietnamese forces surged south, the Viet Cong emerging from their underground labyrinth one last time. Saigon fell. The war was over. But the tunnels remained silent, dark, eternal. The numbers are staggering, but they do not tell the story. More than 3 million dead. Half of them civilians. Whole villages erased. Generations scarred. Children born underground who grew up knowing only the press of dirt, the smell of decay, the taste of fear. Men who crawled into the earth and never came back. Women who gave birth in chambers that doubled as tombs. Doctors who cut flesh with pliers while bombs shook the ceilings. The tunnels were not just battlefields. They were prisons, homes, graves, wombs. They were the true heart of the war. And they still exist. Tourists today can crawl through widened passages, their bodies brushing walls that once echoed with screams. They smile for cameras, pose with rusted weapons, laugh nervously at tales of traps and rats. But the earth remembers. It remembers the blood that soaked it, the corpses buried into it, the cries muffled by its walls. The tunnels are quiet now, but if you listen closely, perhaps you can still hear the breath of the men who died there, the laughter of children who never saw daylight, the whispers of fighters who vanished into the dark. Perhaps the tunnels are still alive. Perhaps they are still waiting. This is the story the war tried to bury. Not of politics or ideology, not of victory or defeat, but of tunnels that turned men into ghosts, jungles into graveyards, a country into a nightmare. A war fought not just above the ground, but below it, in a place where sunlight never reached, where fear lived in every shadow, where death was not a possibility but a companion. The tunnels of Vietnam are more than history. They are wounds carved into the earth, scars that will never heal, reminders of what men can endure, and what men can become when the world collapses into darkness. And as you hear these stories, as you imagine the silence, the darkness, the breath of another man in the black ahead, ask yourself one question. If the earth itself opened before you and the tunnels called your name, Would you dare to crawl inside?